Okay, we're live.
We are in Senate Judiciary. This is Thursday, January 26th, 2023, and we're taking up a bill having to do with reporting requirements regarding racial disparities, and it's part of an act relating to Justice Reinvestment 2, which is a process that we work with the Council of State Governments Justice Center in developing information. And it was one of the most eye-opening reports that has been done on racial disparities in the criminal justice system in Vermont. And our thanks to the Justice Center for all their hard work. But this is a bill to, one of the things they found was our data is very bad. It was difficult to comb through and get the information. And Ben Novogosky from Legislative Council will explain why this bill is necessary, or not why it's necessary, because he didn't know, but how this developed and why the bill is written the way it is and what it does.
Thank you, Senator Sears. Ben Novogosky from the Office of Legislative Counsel. I'm going to take a moment to share my screen for the bill itself. Okay, so as the committee can see, this is S14, which is an act relating to Justice 2 reporting requirements. This bill proposes to create additional reporting requirements to assess the effectiveness of Justice Reinvestment 2 expenditures. As Senator Sears alluded to, the Joint Legislative Justice Oversight Committee over the summer heard a lot of testimony and received reports from the Council of State Governments on the state of Vermont's Justice Reinvestment 2 initiatives. A lot of that reporting showed racial disparities between people of color, from ranging from rates of incarceration, recidivism, so on and so forth. So as a way to, one of the techniques to help combat those disparities is greater data collection, and really not knowing the successes or failures of these investments was a key point of discussion within the committee, because while there's information on where this money is going to and to the various state agencies and entities that are receiving it, there wasn't a lot of outcome indicator data about the results of those investments and whether or not they're actually addressing the harms they're meant to remedy. So this bill is an attempt to provide some outcome indicators in addition to the reporting of the expenditures themselves. So as you'll see in section 1, the change here is a minor one on lines 15 to 16, and this just re-emphasizes that other entities that aren't listed or aren't the Department of Corrections, Department of Health, Mental Health, DCF, and the Attorney General's office will work in consultation with one another to call this data together and present it in a report, which this committee has already received the first one under this mandate earlier this month on January 15th. So the reason why this language is added is just to really belt and suspenders that other entities that may receive money either now or in the future that aren't specifically contemplated will work in concert together to get the data to the proper people to review. So, and some of those entities now that are really worked through or funded through either DOC or the AG's office are, for instance, like the Vermont Network. They receive funding through DOC to help support some of those justice reinvestment initiatives. So that's an example of one entity that wasn't explicitly captured, but also it could broaden to encompass others in the future. You scroll down onto page 2. This is really the meat of the changes in subsection C, starting on line 16. So the report required to subsection A, which really describes the various funding, and I should go through this, to be honest. So there are various initiatives related with Justice Reinvestment 2 funding, specifically funding for DV intervention programming with DOC, funding for transitional housing capacity with DOC and other departments, DOC's data collection, their OMS system, and there was some funding that went towards that over the summer with Justice Reinvestment, funding for community-based mental health and substance use services for people under supervision of DOC, and funding provided for diversion, restorative justice program like CJC's diversion, and the barge program under DCF, and any of the general fund expenditures related. So to supplement that reporting section, new subsection C is created on, like I said, starting on line 16 on page 2. So the report will now include an assessment of the impacts of these JR2 expenditures and its related initiatives on crime and violence. So those are those outcome indicators. So it should explain whether those expenditures are effectively addressing a reduction in crime and violence, and if they are not, an explanation as to why. It should include data related to reductions in recidivism, violations of conditions of release, probation, parole, furlough, and whether any new offenses occur. And then that data should also be classified based on whether those violations are criminal or civil in nature. So again, this is to provide sort of the other side, or the bookend, so to speak, of whether these investments are being effective and why not, so that the committees of jurisdiction have that information and can make policy decisions based on that. And the act will go into effect July 1st this year.
Quick question for between lines 19 and 20 on page 2. So it says, the report shall explain whether the expenditures are effectively reducing crime and violence, and if not, why. Would we also get an explanation as to why they are effective, if they are effective? If that question makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, I guess that could be drafted to be more explicit. I think the meaning behind it is that, yes, it would be explained, but that could be made clearer.
Okay. I just didn't know if it was splitting hairs or not. I just want to, because when things are working, I want to make sure that people who are reading the report know, oh, it's working for X, Y, and Z reason. So, and of course, if it's not working, then we find out why as well.
Good point.
So that, yeah, that's a change that would be relatively simple, but we're on the way.
Thanks.
According to this, despite an increasing focus on improving reentry outcomes, only half of the states report data on outcomes for the millions of people sentenced to probation supervision.
Is there something that you'd want to incorporate into the
Well, I
report?
think it's time that we receive, we try to get data on recidivism amongst the population that is incarcerated, but I don't ever remember seeing information on success or failure of probation. Anybody else remember? You have anything? Maybe folks could comment on that, but it seems to me that I'd like to know if they're being successful or not. In the current climate here in Vermont, with frontline probation officers having to cover hospital shifts when inmates are in the hospital doing their own supervision, can lead to reincarceration or behaviors and so forth. So it would be helpful if we could get data on both on recidivism amongst probationers, actual new crimes, not necessarily violations of conditions of probation that are not crimes.
I think both are kind of important, sort of that breakdown around what's a violation of conditions that isn't a new crime, and what's a new crime, what's a technical violation. Like, I think that would actually be helpful to have that breakdown of why people are.
I try to make it simple, but I don't, well, we can hear from them if we suggest both, and I make it full.
So just as a question, so starting on, I guess it would be line 21 at the bottom of page 2, going on to 3. Would the committee want to add language, just essentially expressing, you know, an explanation of any successes and failures in reductions in recidivism, violations of conditions of release, probation, parole, so on and so forth? So adding sort of successes and failures to.
Well, just, you know, using whatever we use, we get figures for recidivism of people that are incarcerated. We don't get information on those that are on probation. Maybe, you know, the diversion programs claim, many of them claim 90% success rates. I don't know how they're judging that, but we don't have similar information on whether probation is at 90%, 50%, or 30% success. I have no idea.
So that can maybe be attached to the end of the clause, you know, because where it talks about classifying violations as criminal or civil
Yeah, and I'd like to
nature.
have that data on, you know, on racial disparities as well, whether people of color are more likely to be violated.
So basically classify those offenses in addition to their criminal or civil nature based on race, and then the nature of the violation, be it probation, parole, furlough, so on and so forth.
Mhm.
Okay.
I mean, it's a bad idea. We can hear from people why it is.
Easy enough to do in legislation.
Well, if half the states aren't doing it, it means half the states are doing it. So,
Well, I can make those changes depending, and obviously based on what the committee further decides.
secretly, this came from the Justice Center.
Are there any other questions about, I guess, what the bill is at least attempting to achieve?
I think it's pretty clear.
I can stop my share and.
Speaking of the Justice Center, Ellen Whalen Worst is here, live from Benson, or Orwell. She's somewhere in Addison County, folks.
Cornwall, yeah.
Thank you.
Hello.
Good morning, Ellen. Nice to see you here. Thank you for joining us.
Yeah, it's great to see everybody.
We have a new committee, and I think since we have so many people, I'm going to ask folks, starting with Senator Norris, to just go around and introduce themselves.
Good morning, Ellen. Senator Bob Norris, Franklin County.
Senator Tanya Vygotsky, Chittenden Central.
Dick Sears, Bennington County.
Nader Hashim, Wyndham County.
And Phil Baruth, Chittenden Central District.
He's got a new district.
Oh, that's right.
It's the same Senator Baruth, but
I don't have a county anymore.
but welcome, Ellen, and thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me. I am about a drive away, but I took advantage of Zoom, though I missed the state capitol. It was always, I think I told someone I still have a credit in the cafeteria from 2020 that I need to figure out my code for so I can get some coffee when I'm there next.
Well, I'm sure we can have you to the State House in the near future. We're dealing with a number of different bills. So. We're taking up S14 this morning. So if you have any comments on the data, you were part of the Justice Reinvestment two team. And
Yeah. No, I'm happy to jump in, and I was just trying to correspond with my colleague Madeline Dardot, who some of you may have gotten a chance to work with, but I was really fortunate to work with this committee and Senator Sears, Senator Baruth, and others who were on the Judiciary Committee back in 2019, 2020 on the first phase of justice reinvestment, which was when we came in and worked with DOC and all kinds of folks to analyze the data and present what we were seeing as big challenges in the correction system, and then the recommendations that the legislature ultimately passed in the bill in the spring of, or the early summer of 2020. And then Madeline, who's my colleague, was part of the team who came in and worked with Vermont, particularly with the Department of Corrections, but other folks as well, to help implement the bill and to really try to stand it up so that it could achieve its outcomes. Of course, 2020 was a strange time, right? In many ways, there were the changes in populations that had nothing to do with justice reinvestment, that were entirely related to COVID-19, and responses that DOC and others had to the courts shutting down. I mean, there were just so many factors. But I was just asking Madeline on this conversation of data, we're huge data proponents. That's sort of the main foundation of justice reinvestment, is that it's hard to make decisions about anything if you don't know what the data is or isn't showing you. And that was a huge part of what we worked on with DOC through justice reinvestment too. And I know that because Vermont went through the implementation process, that there was regular reporting from the Department of Corrections to the Justice Center, at least, on recidivism data. So as I was listening to you all talk about this, I mean, I think the discussion about the language in the bill makes a lot of sense to us. It's really important to be getting that information about everything you were touching on, recidivism, but what kind of recidivism, technical violations versus new crime, and then anywhere else you can get more granular on those, right? What types of technical violations, what types of new offenses, all of that just gives you so much more, and the agencies so much more to work with. So Madeline was just sending me over, I think DOC, according to what she was telling me, was doing a really beautiful job of sending over monthly data that reported out on different metrics of recidivism. So I think if this language in the bill were to move forward, and I don't want to speak for DOC, but at least from what we were receiving from them, I would hope it wouldn't be a huge lift for them to be reporting that data to you all, or somehow finding another way of making sure that the legislature and other folks have that information. And I've got the spreadsheet in front of me just to look at what we had, because I wanted to see what pieces of what you're discussing were part of that regular data monitoring process that we were doing with DOC. And as soon as I can take a closer look, I can weigh back in and let you know if it hit on probation specifically, or was it sort of the whole of the community supervision population, and then what types of recidivism were broken out as well.
okay. Any questions for Ellen? Thank you so much.
Sure, I'll raise my hand when I have more information from
Yeah,
what
would you please, and just feel free to break in. Yeah, the next witness is Isaac Dana. Isaac is here in person, has a chart or a screen share.
Does anyone know the name Maripat? Can to begin the Zoom meeting?
What's the name?
Maripat, M-A-R-I-P-A-T. Told them to email me, let me know who they are.
Okay, good morning. Hello, my name is Isaac Dano. I'm the Executive Director of Policy at the Department of Corrections. And apologies, the commissioner is out this week, so you are stuck with me. I'm about 2 months into the job, so I will lean very heavily on my colleagues. I'm joined today by Jess King-Moore, who's our research and data lead at the department, Dale Crook, who's our director of field services, Derek Yadovnik, who is our director of restorative justice, as well as Kristen Calver, who is our financial lead at the department. Okay. So with that, just wanted to start with how clear the success justice reinvestment has been when we look at the data. We can see here in yellow, it's the incarcerated population in Vermont from 2015 to 2022, a 30% decrease. And of course, COVID-19 accelerating that trend. And then when we look at the community supervision, which is in blue here, we can see at this during the same time period, a 44% overall decrease.
Can I just ask, have you looked at national trends? Are we bucking national trends or are we in line with national trends?
That's a good question. I have to turn to our team for that. I'm not sure.
Ellen might actually be the best to report on that from CSG, but it's my understanding that population across systems has been on a decline due to COVID. I don't think Vermont is.
Well, I hear what you're saying, Dale, but I'm looking at 2015 to now. We've got a really nice downward. Is that, I guess what I'm asking is nationally 2015 to now, so not necessarily COVID related, is there an up or down trend?
And Ellen, maybe we'll
maybe that nobody has that ready.
I believe there's been a downtrend nationwide with population, incarcerated and community supervision.
Okay. Yeah, I was just react. Oh, I'm sorry, Ellen.
Oh, no, I would just say that probably is true if you took all 50 states, but and I'm happy to pull up and I can circulate to Peggy some pieces that we have on our website. It really depends. COVID obviously interrupted a lot of things, but there are states where they saw that dip and then it pretty quickly has started to climb back up. Going back to 2015, there are a bunch of states that are seeing their incarcerated populations either decrease much more slowly than I would say Vermont's has, or, not at all, or maybe even climbing. So it's a little all over the place, as you would expect. But it is sort of, we're certainly experiencing nationally, there's a lot of criminal justice reform. There's a lot of efforts put into decarcerating folks or finding safe alternatives to incarceration or releases. So I think Vermont is sort of generally on trend, but also stands apart when you go back to 2015 to see those decreases. And even just that the COVID dip has not immediately rebounded, right? As courts reopened and all kinds of other factors have shifted, that Vermont has been able to not see that big of a bounce back to pre-COVID levels, I think is significant. But I'll try to send something to Peggy maybe to circulate to the committee as well.
Okay, thank you.
So drilling down on this just a little bit further, when we look at the incarcerated population specifically by crime type, we can see that the trends in decarceration are most pronounced here in some of those less serious crimes. So the blue here is serious felonies. That would be aggravated assault, sexual assault, homicide. Those numbers staying, relatively level, coming down a little bit, but particularly in felony drug crimes, some of those misdemeanors, those have the number of individuals who are incarcerated for those charges has decreased over time.
Do you drill down by, when you have serious crime, is yours same schedule as the Big 12 or the listed crimes, or is it different?
I believe it's the same. I look at Jess. Do you have a? I'm not sure if you heard the question.
When you are drilling down on the numbers of what is a serious crime versus other crime.
No, Senator, this is Dale Crook from Director of Field Services. We have crime types based on severity. So felony seriouses are really the most severe, the murders, as Isaac was saying. So they're a category of crimes that that the department determined was the most severe. Then felony person would be assaults, domestic assaults, and it just kind of keeps going down. It's not based on listed or non-listed. It's not based on the Big 12 or violent or non-violent. Generally, the violent offenses would be in the felony person and serious, and more of the property drug related crimes will be in the property and drug crimes. And then we have motor vehicle. So we've kind of categorized them based on type, both for felony and misdemeanor.
Breaking into an occupied dwelling, a serious crime under your scenarios?
It's either serious felon or serious, but I think it would be a serious felony serious. I don't think it's a felony person.
Okay, thank you.
Just had a quick question. And then looking at 2018 and 2024, I'm looking at your the top bar. It says 64 incarcerated or 64 crimes, and then I looked at the population 948, and there's a population 2022 of 771, and it only went down one. Am I to assume that the reason for that is because those more serious crimes, the incarceration time is longer, so it's a duplicate count here?
No, these are snapshots. So this is, so the 2018 is a snapshot of one day, and that is the makeup of the population we have in the facility. Correct, Jessica? I just want to make sure I'm saying that correctly. So the 64 on the 2018, the very top one, if you look on the legend, it says they're uncategorized. So what that would lead to me believe that 64 is individual. We just haven't had our classification of facilities yet. So the changes, the colors year by year are based on the category of crime.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
If I could add, this is Jess Kingmore with the Department of Corrections. Uncategorized is typically going to be those held for the U.S. Marshals, and we have less data on their crimes just because they're not a technical Vermont incarcerated individual. We're just holding them for the U.S. Marshals.
And so that change in the makeup of the population in Vermont, the incarcerated population, has had a lot of repercussions. So as we see here in the blue arrow, like I said, 30% decrease in the incarcerated population, 44% decrease in community supervision. But however, the percent of the supervised population, the felony serious crime has increased by 20% in the incarcerated population, 67% among community supervised. When we look at the incarcerated risk to reoffend, that again is a DOC metric. 15% increase in the incarcerated population. And as I believe we spoke about in Senate Judiciary earlier, this is sort of an expected outcome of justice reinvestment. As we start to decarcerate for less serious violations, the population that remains incarcerated has been convicted or charged with higher crimes.
Yeah, and unfortunately, you had a 67% increase in community supervision. And yet, during the same period, we've seen the shifting of community-based officers, whether they be correctional officers or probation officers, into the facilities to make up for the shortage, which gives you less supervision with more people to be supervised. It's a conundrum, and I know in the Appropriations Committee, we spoke of it this week with the commissioner. I think it's really something that we need to pay sharp attention to, because many of these folks without the supervision find themselves in further trouble when they get reincarcerated. That's not the goal, obviously. I really can't emphasize enough. You got that increase in community in people being supervised, yet a decrease in the staff to supervise them.
Dale, do you have any comments on that you want to add as Director of Community Supervision Field Program?
I mean, the senator is correct. So, I mean, it is not unknown that the department is having staffing challenges. And we do have a responsibility to make sure that we manage our population, our incarcerated population, and right now it's really just a staffing issue. And the commissioner of the department is trying to make best utilization of its resources to best meet our statutory requirements.
Thanks. And we showed this slide last time we were in Senate Judiciary, but just looking at the total folks who are sentenced, that's that pink bar at the top, and then the total detained, the bottom bar. So giving you an idea of as our incarcerated population for folks who are sentenced has dropped, we're still seeing that detained population starting to creep up here. I believe Judge Zone also spoke on this. Yes, Senator.
Quick question. So I just want to confirm that people who are detained in that lower bar are those folks who are being held for cash bail or, you know, flash sites. What's encompassed in that detained population?
Right, so I think that would be anyone pre-sentencing. And I believe the courts are probably best equipped to speak to bail, and who's being held for cash bail or held without bail. We usually defer those questions to the courts, but that would be anyone pre-adjudication.
Thank you. Yeah, and you know, the reason I ask is because especially lately we get so many constituents who are upset about, you know, this quote unquote catch and release thing that they think is happening with the system. And you know, I mean, I feel like that chart indicates otherwise. So that's just one thing I was curious about.
Yeah, I've had the same. I think we all have.
Yeah. Just one quick question. It's probably behind the bar of my answer here. Is the federal population included in those detained? Is it, or they'll just state?
I'm looking at Jess here. She's shaking her head. No, it looks like. Is that right, Jess?
No, if they're held for the U.S. Marshals, we code them as hold. If that's purely the only reason that they're there.
Okay, thanks.
It's a relatively small number as well compared to this total.
But that was down significantly this week.
The federal hold population?
No, the detention population.
Detention population. I would have to look at the data for this week.
I think some cases are now being processed that were on hold, but somebody reported that to me. I thought maybe I was dreaming.
In the interest of time, we will keep moving forward. So just wanted to bring us back to justice reinvestment and looking at bed savings. I prepared this report. Here, I believe everyone should have a copy of Act 185, which lays out for fiscal years 21 and 22, the out-of-state bed savings and where they were directed. And so for fiscal year 21, a little north of 777,000, and for fiscal year 22, that 1.986 million. So now turning to the text of S14, I just wanted to clarify a bit about DOC's reporting capabilities. And as the person who put this report together, I think I can speak to that a little bit about where I struggled. Senator, did you have a-
Yeah, I do have a question just around spending and whether or not we're looking specifically at what we're spending on different types of crimes. Like, for example, are we looking at spending on low-level personal use drug crimes? Are we looking at like how that spending actually breaks down?
Right, we can, I have some exercises here. Also, if you turn to 185, you can see how the different amounts were allocated for fiscal year 21 and fiscal year 22. And so that breaks it down to different sums. So for example, funding for the Vermont Network, funding for CJCs.
Okay, but we're not actually looking at like what we're spending on incarceration of different types of crime.
This is just JR2 funding. There's other funding.
Right, so I guess my question is sort of looking at things that, and it's going back to a previous conversation, if we're looking at what we're spending on something like personal use that could have been diverted rather pre-charge rather than coming in. I'm just wondering if you have, if we do look at that, and if not, if you have the capability to look at stuff like that. So I am still thinking about how do we divert and reinvest.
Right, well, certainly when you speak about pre-charge, $317,000 went to CJCs. And of course, they differ a little bit in their practices across the state, but we've seen a great amount of success, and Derek can speak to that at greater length, about the use of pre-charge referrals through the CJCs and state attorneys. That's been highly successful. So, like $85,000 of that funding went to DEI training. So trying to really invest in our CJCs across the state. But specifically when it comes to crime types, for example, like low-level drug crime, I don't believe justice reinvestment has been directed. I looked to the legislature for that, but has not been directed towards certain crime types.
Okay.
It's been a little more broad.
Awesome, thank you.
Yeah. So just turning back to the slide here. DOC is able to report, across our facilities, our field offices, central office. However, we do struggle. We're not positioned to communicate across the Agency of Human Services broadly or other state entities. So, for example, when I was compiling this report, we look to the Secretary's office to coordinate across all of our sister departments, and then also to reach out, for example, to the Attorney General's office or to other state agencies. We sort of have a vertical communication, and then they do the horizontal communication. So perhaps a recommendation, looking at the text of S14, would be to amend who is quarterbacking, submitting this report. I would recommend that it would sit within the Secretary's office, as it's sort of outside of DOC's purview to be communicating across all of AHS and with the Attorney General's office. So suggestion there. DOC is able to report, as Ellen spoke, about trends among incarcerated supervised populations in Vermont. We have a very robust webpage, the research and data reports that Jess's team puts together. That includes an annual budget report. Some of these are quite lengthy reports. They're updated on a daily basis for our population reports. So all that data exists and it's being communicated. However, some of the data that is described in S14 is a little broader than that. It is population level data, looking at crime and violence across the state, as Ben spoke about. That is, I would note that we do not have access to that data. That I think that would be a Department of Public Safety responsibility outside of our data gathering capabilities to look at crime and violence across the state of Vermont. But when it comes to the incarcerated and supervised populations in Vermont, more than happy to analyze that data. We do have access to recidivism data from 2019, but I would also note that's a 3-year look back. And Jess can speak to that more if we have questions. We're also happy to report on out-of-state bed counts and changes in population levels and funding allocations. But for certain instances, so for example, violations of parole, that would probably sit with the parole board, again, outside of the DOC jurisdiction. So I just wanted to be clear about what DOC can gather, how we communicate across different departments and outside of AHS, and then also about what kind of data reporting capabilities we have, just so we can get you the right information. And as if we are compiling, if I'm compiling this report next year for you, just wanted to make sure that it's information that DOC can actually gather. Any questions on that? Any thoughts from the DOC folks on the call? They did hit on. Okay. Great. And with that, thank you so much.
Thank you. Next witness is Donna Davis, Executive Director of Racial Equity Agency of Administration.
Good to see you in person.
Thank you. Good to be here in person.
Welcome back.
Thank you. Good morning, buenos dias. For the record, Susana Davis, Racial Equity Director for the state. This might be your quickest testimony today because I think that overall, we have no concerns with the bill. It seems extremely straightforward, the additions that have been made. And we have sat on the Justice Reinvestment Project through its 2020-ish iteration, and now through the domestic violence track as well, and have seen the evolution of the program and have been generally very pleased with how it's gone and with the level of engagement from all of the partners who have been part of it. It has been very rewarding, I think, to be in the room of people who are raising equity issues without us having to be the ones to raise the equity issues. So I feel very confident that this entire process has been conducted with a genuine and constant eye toward equity and toward inclusion. That being said, I would really like to pan out a little bit and talk about some of the ancillary factors that we want to think about. And I know this committee has already done a lot of thinking about these things, but I'd be remiss not to mention them. First, as we think about the previous witness, my colleague from DOC, who mentioned the trouble that has come with communication, what's permitted to be shared and to whom, I think the term was who's quarterbacking. And so one of the really important things that I'd like to highlight is the importance of being able to have inter and intra-departmental communication. Particularly in our role as racial equity, we're empowered by statute to identify systemic racism in all 3 branches of government. But it's very difficult for us to do that without visibility into the inner workings of all 3 branches of state government. And so for us, being able to have access to documents as necessary is not only something that was embedded in statute specifically requiring the administration to provide access to documents as needed for us to carry out our mandate. But even absent that provision in statute, it just helps us be able to do our jobs better when we can have that fluid communication. So as we think about structure, as we think about confidentiality and what's able to be disclosed and what's not, that's something that for us, we have run up against a number of times that has been a challenge. Recognizing, of course, there are certain federal and other regulatory hurdles there. There's some things that maybe cannot be disclosed. Regardless of whether or not I really want it to be. So recognizing that some of those administrative burdens exist as well, it's our request that whenever possible, that there be a mechanism to allow for that easily and seamlessly, that also protects the identities and the situations of the people who are identified in the data. The other thing I'd just like to say is we're constantly thinking about upstream factors. I'm thinking about the charts that we saw just a few moments ago that were tracking things like recidivism or supervised population following release or bed savings, things like that. And I'm thinking about all of the ancillary factors that we should be thinking about to make sure that we're really releasing and supervising people in community environments that are going to support their reintegration and in some cases recovery. We know that expansion of access to Medicaid reduces violent crime rates. This is a fact point that has been validated in numerous states, everything from New Mexico to North Carolina. So we know that expansion of access to healthcare, particularly mental health care and treatment and recovery programs, does reduce the incidence and rates of violent crime. And conversely, the shrinking of access to health services has been shown to increase rates of violent crime in different jurisdictions around the country. So as we think about continuing to work to reduce our incarcerated population, the availability of recovery and support services is going to be really important. Again, I know this committee knows that already. I'm saying it for all of the people in the ether who may not yet. The last thing that I would say on upstream factors is that we're also looking very critically at housing. Housing is a major, major component of a person's success in not just remaining out of the justice system on the front end, but also staying out of it on the back end. And not just having access to a place to live, right? The availability of housing is already a challenge in Vermont. But in addition, the housing being of acceptable quality and maintenance, right? You don't want to have substandard housing that's going to end up contributing to chronic diseases and health conditions. Also, the affordability of that housing. It's one thing to say, well, there are houses all over the state. Yeah, but they're all $500,000. So being able to have access to housing, affordability of housing, maintenance and quality of housing, and then a strong regulatory system that allows people to safely be able to petition for improvements if they need to as tenants, or better yet, as homeowners, right? So thinking about the housing market and the ways in which it does or does not make itself available to people who are at risk of entering or who are coming out of the justice system is another important piece of that. I think that's probably everything I wanted to cover today, but of course I'm happy to take any questions you may have. Thank you.
I know that it used to be a challenge that people were sort of stuck in being incarcerated because they didn't have a house to go to. Do we have data on what those numbers look like now?
I don't actually have those right now. I will do some digging to see if they exist and you just haven't surfaced them yet. I will say that I would be surprised if that picture had changed, unfortunately.
I suspect that maybe it's gotten worse, not better.
Yeah, correct. And again, I mean, thinking more broadly, we're looking to expand our state population. And so part of that means not just being able to support a housing market for those who are already here, but also those who we're looking to attract as well.
Did you want to comment on that?
Oh, so we do have that data.
Okay.
Yes, and when you start to drill into it, reason folks are still incarcerated without housing, rather than them being incarcerated for experiencing homelessness, it's more that the housing placement has not been deemed appropriate. So for example, someone who has been convicted, serving sentence for domestic violence, and their housing option is moved back in with the survivor, or someone who has been convicted of arson, and the owner landlord does not want that person to live in that unit, someone with a child sexual assault charge wanting to live in a unit with children, things of that nature. Just clear.
Right. Yeah, I will note that I've been saying for years that using a category of lack of housing rather than the term appropriate housing does create confusion to the general public, believing that you have people incarcerated because they can't find a house. It's appropriate housing.
Absolutely.
I've been asking the department to change that through about 3 commissioners. It just seems logical to me to describe exactly why they're not being released.
I agree, Senator. I would love to, Mr. Chair, I'd love to pursue that conversation as well.
And what is it that makes it inappropriate? I mean, I had a guy that worked for me who was an alcoholic, but he went and worked in a bar and he was fine. I mean, it doesn't mean everybody who's alcoholic can work in a bar as a bartender, but he was fine and, did well with it, but.
I think this highlights also the importance of consistency, or at least shared understanding in our definitions, because, for example, in my previous life, when I was in New York, I was doing work around health and housing. And so one of the main factors that we used to determine appropriateness of housing was size. So you can have a family of 6 people being offered a 2-bedroom apartment, and it's better than a studio, but it's still not considered appropriate because it's not an appropriate size for the number of people, right? As a matter of fact, if you look at the architecture in a place like New York City, you can tell which public housing buildings were created during which era, because there was a certain point in time where they started suddenly caring about airflow and windows because of chronic disease, right? And so thinking about the number of people that's considered appropriate to 1 bedroom, extrapolating that to determine what size of a house is appropriate for a family of a given size. So it's okay. I would say appropriateness is one of the key factors that public health uses to determine, size of dwelling is one of the key factors that public health uses to determine appropriateness. But again, I mean, like you said, if we're releasing someone into a recovery program or perhaps 3-quarter housing or something like that, is it appropriate to put the person in a unit that's right above a bar or something like that? Yeah. Is that considered appropriate? And I think us being able to modernize our definitions of these terms would be helpful and unify them to some degree across industries.
Yeah.
I have just one quick question for Director Davis. I sat, and maybe off the topic a little bit here. I sat on Health Judiciary last year.
We do that frequently.
We do that frequently. I'm going to continue that trend. I sat on House Judiciary last year in reference to H 546. Essentially, we spent hours, if not days, on this. And one of your concerns at that point was filling the positions. And in reading your report, it says you were going to start the hiring process for lead position in January. With today's market or lack thereof, how is the hiring process coming?
It has been a bit of a challenge. We do have applicants for the lead role. We're in the thick of the interviewing process right now for the lead role. We wanted to be really thoughtful about how to build this team. And so we have not posted for the 2 analyst roles simultaneously because we wanted the lead to be able to participate in selecting the people that the person would be supervising. So we've held on posting the analyst roles. The lead role we're interviewing. Because this is a public hearing, I don't want to comment on the set of applications we've received. But thank you for asking, and maybe you would love to just give you an offline response about how you experience this market.
Yes.
Yep.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Thank you very much. Good to see you. Our next witness is Dr. Eitan. Yeah, we all know, and welcome back.
Thank you, sir. And Happy New Year to you all,
Happy
senators.
New Year to you.
I don't know if I'll be as quick. Well, first, let me say for the record, Dr. Eitan Nasreddin Longo, and I'm here in my capacity as chair of the Racial Disparities Advisory Panel. As many of you know, we meet once a month for 2 hours. It's really not enough time. I need to give some thought as to what that's about. But I say that simply to say that I was not able to bring S14 to a full meeting, but I was able to write a letter to the entire panel and ask for feedback on this bill by noon yesterday. And I have 2 responses. One is from me, but the other is from Aaron Jacobson, who is an assistant attorney general, who is the AG's representative on the panel. My recommendation is quicker than hers, and I would just like to put this in now. I realize that this bill asks for the report to be sort of disseminated among entities that receive Justice Reinvestment 2 funds. I would also like to ask for you to consider that it also be forwarded to the Division of Racial Justice Statistics that Director Davis just spoke of, for which hiring is underway. One of the issues, and you'll remember this probably, with the division when we were formulating it, was the incredible siloing of data among the different departments and agencies in the criminal justice system within the state. One of the subsidiary raison d'etre of the division was to, in fact, work against that siloing and make the data comprehensible and available across this system, where we have systems of data collection, retrieval, storage that are simply incompatible and do not speak with one another. One of the jobs of the division is to work against that so that we can get that data together and make really, really clear statements about what's going on with regard to racial disparity across the criminal justice system. So in that spirit, I would like to recommend that one of the bodies that gets this report would be also the Division of Racial Justice Statistics. The second
objection, let me just ask the committee. I don't think there's an objection to adding that. Thank you for the suggestion.
More than welcome. Thank you for considering it. The second point that I need to bring up, and this is from, as I say, Aaron Jacobson, is towards the end of the report. It is on the second page, literally line 21. She writes that she would amend the language to say, quote, "The report shall include any data related to reductions in recidivism," here's her point, "or evidence of desistance." That's what she wants to add, that phrase, or evidence of desistance. Desistance, sir.
Oh.
She writes further.
Eitan?
Yes.
I'm sorry, I'm not familiar with desistance.
Well, let me read what else she writes here. That may help you, because I wasn't entirely familiar either. I love lawyers. I propose this because recidivism data does not always provide the most accurate picture of whether a justice reform effort is working to reduce crime. Rather, desistance data is widely recognized to paint a more full accurate, and fair picture of a reduction in criminal activity. That's because although a recidivism data point could be evidence of exactly what it sounds like, for instance, an individual committing another crime, that same data point could in fact represent a conviction flowing from racial disparities in arrests, charging, and sentencing. Furthermore, recidivism data doesn't always reveal if someone who was previously convicted of a serious crime later commits a less serious crime and is thus taking a step in the right direction away from serious criminality. And that's what Desistance gets at, is it's a far more nuanced and subtle approach to looking at the commission of crimes.
So, as I understand it, if somebody was stealing 12 cars a year and now has dropped down to 1 car a year, that's an improvement? Is that?
Well, yes, and there are also probably many more examples we could put out that are less bleak, but yes. She says it doesn't, putting in that phrase, or evidence of desistance, does not create an obligation for entities to collect desistance data. Rather, it simply allows those entities to report such data should they have it available, and for the legislature to therefore consider it when examining the efficacy of any given program.
I think what I would like to do is that the next time we take up the bill is ask Aaron Jacobson to come in, and the one thing I'm not concerned with, that actually that information may be helpful, but I'm concerned with national statistics on recidivism, since there are no definitions, and how we would match that. So if you still kept the recidivism information and perhaps this information as well, and I think the committee would need a little more time to process this, but I appreciate you raising it. I think I now understand where she's coming from.
Yes, good. And just to make a point of it, she doesn't say replacing recidivism, she's adding or evidence of desistance. In other words, it's not a zero-sum game.
And I think the professor probably has a better word for it.
I just looked up desistance because I hadn't heard it before, but apparently it refers to the reduction in crime as people reach adulthood. So a sort of natural process of crime coming down through growing older, as we see with. Yeah. Is that what you're after?
Actually, yeah, what I looked at didn't actually only speak about the age issue, but yes.
Okay.
Well, it's an unfortunate thing that we have a professor of English.
It is always important to have a professor of English.
I apologize for jumping in. I was gonna just listening to this, something that occurred to me is that the committee might consider on this topic is one way that I sometimes think about desistance is sort of a measure of success, right? So recidivism is a measure of failure, and desistance, or however you want to the terminology, but the concept might be trying to also understand a person's success. Where I immediately go to is thinking about technical violations, right? So when people are returned to prison for a technical violation, it's because something or many things in Vermont, knowing there's a graduated sanctions approach, which means people are sort of moving up a grid in their behavior in the negative sense that leads to them being violated or revoked back into prison. But there's also an incentives grid, right? There's good behavior. And it might be interesting. Again, I don't want to pretend this would be easy to collect or report, but it could be informative for anyone to know more about what were the successes that a person was achieving, right? Were they regularly attending AA as they were intended to? Were they looking for a job? Were they attending the batterers intervention programming that they were assigned to? And still they absconded, or still they did these things, right? So you sort of have that full view of both the failures and the successes. That might be worth learning more about.
we always understood people take a step backwards, maybe too forward, hopefully, but frequently take a step backwards during the process.
I think the other thing for me about adding this piece that seems important is it doesn't just look at an individual failing, but it looks at the areas where we need to grow resources within our community. Because a lot of these technical violations sometimes are about, I don't have public transportation near me, so I couldn't get a ride, or, there are no counselors taking new people. So I think that it looks beyond just an individual at the larger social system.
And we were just discussing housing.
Yes.
Okay, so what I would ask Peggy to do is, the next time we take up S14 is to ask Aaron and anyone else who wants to comment on it, perhaps the department, could get in touch with her in between now and then to make sure that we're all on the same page. So what you're looking for, what you can do and what you can't do. I don't want to put you in a position where the information would be extremely difficult. All right.
And Senator Baru, thank you kindly for your definition.
Is there anything else?
That's all I have.
Okay, nice to see you and Happy New Year to you.
Yes, lovely to see you all. Take care and be healthy.
Thank you. Our next witness is Terry Corson, State Court Administrator. State Court Administrator.
Thank you very much, Terry Corson, State Court Administrator. And I wasn't exactly sure for what reason I was asked to come to testify, but I'm assuming it has to do with the proposed amendments adding new data points and what the judiciary might be able to provide regarding those data points. So that's what I kind of geared my testimony to. And I know that there was a bail question that came up earlier, and I knew Judge Zoney would be better able to answer that. So that's why he's here, in case you still have questions regarding that one chart. But in terms of the proposed amendments, we are able to certainly provide data for some of them. The recidivism, we normally don't have that, but now I understand Department of Corrections has, it sounds like, robust reporting in that regard. We are able to provide information regarding violations of conditions of release. Normally, we would be given, for example, a time frame, whether it's county by county, statewide, but whatever parameters our people have in mind, certainly we're happy to, provide the data. And I don't know if it would be in conjunction with Department of Corrections requests or how often, but we would have certainly that volume of data, and then also violations of probation. Same thing, we would have that information, we just need the parameters, the time frame, et cetera. And if you have kind of those parameters in mind now, we can tell you now. I know the report deadline is January 15th, so plenty of time to make whatever adaptations we might need to make sure we're providing the data that you're asking for. Violations of parole, we normally wouldn't have that data, but we assume probation and parole would have that. And then violations of furlough, same thing. We don't normally follow that, but we assume Department of Corrections would. And then lastly, though, whether any new offenses occur. And thank you also to, I learned a new term, desistance, which when I called it up, it had both reduction in crime, criminal behavior that occurs after a person reaches adulthood, or abstaining from crime by those with a previous pattern of offending. Nice. So I guess it has a broader, may have a broader.
And the idea of success, I think.
Yeah, that was really interesting as a counter to recidivism. So we don't normally have data, but I guess if there is something that, whether we do, certainly whether youthful offender and delinquency data might factor into that, but we can provide that type of data. And then the last new proposed amendment, classification, whether criminal or civil. It seems most would be criminal, but again, we have civil data as well if that would tie in. So that's what I have by way of information as to what the judiciary might be able to provide for the new data points.
Thank you. Judge, thank you for joining us. My pleasure. The question was about the detention numbers and bail.
Okay.
We saw numbers from the department of an increase in detentioners. And the question was, what the Vice Chair asked the question.
Sure. So, my question, and I think I broadly speak for a lot of legislators who hear from constituents that there's a catch and release scheme happening. But that chart that we saw earlier, I feel like it is otherwise. There's a increasing number of detainees, and I'm wondering what that population of detainees is comprised of.
Well, Tom Zone, Chief Superior Judge, for the record. So when we talk about the detainees, I was trying to sign on, it didn't work right, so I apologize. I actually have a chart that I put together. This is the DOC chart that they showed you, and it has, as of back in July, like 506 detainees. That's a point in time. Every day, the Department of Corrections sends out an email telling us how many people are in DOC custody as pretrial detainees. I went and I charted this from 2019 and to try to show trends and to see what are we really looking at here. Today, the number was 420. And that shows the drop. That's not February 1st. Back at the first day of the month, it was 456. And I point this out because that number at the beginning of the week, I think it was 450 something. It goes up and it goes down. But the one thing that we're showing is it is still above the historical levels in the past. And so the idea when we talk about people say catch and release, well, the statistics don't really bear that out because if we're looking at past years, we're actually detaining more people pre-trial than we were then. And so as you can see, we're right up there with October of 2022, which was the high point since 2019. So there are actually more people being detained now than have historically been detained. Now, in the pandemic, you can see the numbers dropped very low into the 200 range during it was May of 2020 was the low. But the individuals there are a number of detention, but the simple reality that we deal with in the judiciary is that the sole purpose of bail is to mitigate risk of flight, and to assure that people will show up at court. As of January 13th, the Department of Corrections statistics showed that I believe there was 230 people being held without bail. There was 14 who were being held with bail in an amount less than $1,000. There was 55 who were held between $1,000 and $10,000. There was 70 between 10 and 100,000, and 5 over 100,000. And there was other categories of people, but the majority of people being held right now are held without bail.
And just to confirm, sorry to interrupt, but just to confirm, being held without bail, there has to be a threat of violence in the community, right? Or
No, not necessarily. There's two ways that someone can be held without bail pre-trial. I'm not talking about violation of probation situations. There's two statutes. There is 13 VSA section 7553. Under that statute, if an individual is charged with a crime that has a maximum punishment of life, they are, the court can hold them without bail. The court does not have to find violence in that specifically. There's presumption of detention in a life imprisonment case, but the court still goes through what we call the 7554 factors and determines whether or not it's going to exercise its discretion to release the individual. There's one other way, and I think it's what you're talking about, and that is under 13 VSA section 7553, small a, no parentheses.
Wow, that was impressive.
It's confusing sometimes. A number of years ago, we had a constitutional amendment to address violent individuals who were being released. And the statute says that an individual who is charged with a crime that is a felony, that has as an element an act of violence, if the state establishes by clear and convincing evidence that no condition or combination of conditions is going to present the substantial threat of violence to any person, they may be held without bail. Under the statute, they are entitled to a trial within 60 days. If they do not have the trial commence within 60 days, and if they have not waived that right, the statute provides that they have to have bail imposed. The Supreme Court has addressed that issue because as I said earlier, what's the sole purpose of bail? To reasonably assure appearance. And if the issue for holding someone is violence and danger, and there's no risk of flight from prosecution, that would be inconsistent to apply bail, right? Well, the Supreme Court decided that the amount of bail can be zero. They have had a case where they decided that the court does not have to impose a high monetary amount under 7553A, but after an analysis of the factors, the judge can say that number is zero. And Senator, you didn't-
Yeah, I did have a question on the first reason that you can hold someone without bail, being a life sentence, even if or a potential life sentence, even if there's no violence. Do we have a lot of crimes in which a life sentence could be imposed when no violence occurred?
Habitual offenders, someone could have more than 3 felonies, and they are under 13 BSA Section 11, I believe it is, could be charged with life imprisonment.
Okay, thank you. Is that the only instance with no violence involved?
I can't think of any off the top of my head,
Okay,
but that's the one that comes to mind.
What about drug trafficking at a high level?
30 years, but there may be a provision under Title 18 that could go higher than that, but the one that comes to mind is the 30-year trafficking.
I see.
And I will note, I'm actually giving a presentation on this very topic to House Corrections at 12:30.
maybe I'll come join you.
I'd be happy to go over a PowerPoint.
Seems like a lovely lunchtime conversation.
So, any further questions on that, Senator?
No, that answered a lot of it. Thank you.
And we are continuing to address the data when we look at it. And as I've said a number of times, we recognize there's a backlog. We recognize that when you have individuals detained pre-trial, it's important to make sure that those cases are addressed. And by addressing them, we're going to hopefully also make some significant progress on the backlog with the plans we have.
And is that PowerPoint sent to us? Is that available?
I actually sent it on to the House correction to Bill Petty this morning. I could send you a copy if you'd like. And my second slide says objective to provide, and I underlined it intentionally. So if you get to PowerPoint, you will miss what I'm about to say from the PowerPoint. What I am going to say is general overview. That means there are a lot of other little boxes that could be here, and a lot of other things that could be there. My intent was to give the 30,000-foot overview and not get into the weeds. I think if anyone has questions that want to really dive down, I would absolutely be happy to do that. But the intent of this PowerPoint is not to be the end all. It's just to be basically a starting.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Awesome.
I don't think we have any other witnesses, do we?
No, we could probably break early.
Or we could spend the next 15 minutes eating cookies.
I think that could be part of our break.